Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph. We'll be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Chaf Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Tzitzis, and we pick up today Siman Yud Aleph. We are almost at the end of Sif Beis, top line in the Shulchan Aruch Chaf Amid Aleph. So, really, here in the midst of Sif Beis, the Mechaber picks up with a new halacha that he has not discussed before. Until this point, we have been discussing the teviyah, the spinning of the thread for the tzitzis strings, and we learned the halacha that the teviyah, the spinning, has to be done lishma. Now, says the Mechaber, utzrichin shizira. Not only do the tzitzis strings obviously have to be spun from raw wool into a thread in order to form a string, but the strings then have to be entwined. They have to be twisted together, and we'll explain what that means. Vesheyiyu shizurin lishman. And this shizira, this twisting or entwining of the strings to form at least a double string must be done lishma. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eiskat Yod Gimel, utzrichin. So the first thing that the Chavetz Chaim points out is, like I said, here at the end of Sif Beis, the Mechaber is really teaching us a new halacha. He's teaching us about the requirement of shizira. It's attached to the rest of Sif Beis because it's still discussing the concept of lishma, and it's telling me that the shizira has to be done lishma. The problem, the Chavetz Chaim points out, is somebody might make a mistake and think that this last phrase of Sif Beis somehow goes back on the beginning of Sif Beis. On the beginning of Sif Beis, we spoke about threads for tzitzis strings where the tviyah was done by a non-Jew. We had different cases where it might be that we did not meet the requirement of lishma. Somebody might read Sif Beis and say, oh, okay, so if the tviyah was not done lishma, there's a way to fix the problem. How? Utzrichin shizira. So if you have a thread that was not spun from the raw wool, lishma, it wasn't done lishma, let's say it was done by an Eino Yehudi, which according to the Rambam is puzzle, so now maybe the Mechaber is telling you, you have a string where the tviyah was not done lishma, I'll give you an eitzah. The eitzah is utzrichin shizira. V'sheyu shizurun lishman. Now take it, double it over, and twist it, and now you'll fix the problem. Now you'll meet the requirement of lishma by doing shizira lishma. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, that is not what the Mechaber means. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Yod Gimel utzrichin achute tzitzis ta'alma koi. The Mechaber over here is referring to all tzitzit strings. V'loya tava on akum. He's not going back on the beginning of Sif Beis. He's not referencing back the case of tzitzit strings that were spun by an Eino Yehudi, so they were spun not lishma. No. Tisham loy mahani lahapoislin afilu im shizar nachakach Yisrael lishman. Because as far as that's concerned, according to the Rambam, who says that if an Eino Yehudi spun the wool into a thread, it's puzzle because it doesn't meet the requirement of lishma. Should you take it now, double it over and twist it into a double string and do that lishma, you're not going to fix the problem. Once the spinning was done shaloi lishma, according to the Rambam, it is puzzle. Now we go to Sif, ice cut in your dalit. Shizira. The Mechaber tells us we need shizira. Utstrichin shizira. What is this shizira? Well, the truth is that we have the word shizira, or at least the shirish of the word shizira. We have it by the Meleches HaMishkan in Parshas, probably in Parshas Truma. Sheish Moshazar, the Torah HaKadoshah tells us. When the Torah HaKadoshah talks about the Meleches HaMishkan and the different fabrics and textiles that we need, the Torah tells us, let's see, I don't think, maybe it's not in Truma, it might be in Tzava only. Yeah. Va'asu es ha'ephod, and you should make the ephod, the beautiful ephod that the Kohen Gadol wore, that had the choshen on it. Zahav techeles va'argamon. You had threads made out of gold. They would take gold and they would beat it into very thin plates and then cut it very small, very fine into thread. Tcheles. Then you had threads of blue wool. Va'argamon, purple wool. Toilas shani, some kind of a reddish wool. Vishesh, and then linen. Majazar. All of these threads were taken together and they were twisted, they were entwined together. That's what the word mashazar means. Over here, we have shazira. We need shazira. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting your dalid. What is shazira? Hainu sheyichbalem. You double over the string, achar hatvia, after you spun the raw wool into a string, to form a thread. Now you double it over lishnayim, into two, v'yishzerem, and then you twist it or entwine it together. What does that mean? Well, here I have, these are actually tzitzis strings that were removed from an old beged. Now, this string that I'm holding in my hand is actually not one string. This is actually 8 strings twined together. How so? It's 2 strings. Each one of them is itself made out of 4 individual strings. I would try to show it to you here on the camera, but I just don't think the camera is able to pick it up. It's too fine, I think. But you could see over here, I'll put it against a black background, you could see over here, I started to untwine this string. So you have 2 strings that are twisted together, but each one of those 2 strings you could also untwist. Each one of them is actually made out of 4 strings. So this is what we call kafel shmoina. This one tzitzis string that I'm holding over here is actually not one string. It's actually 8 strings twisted together. Now what the Chavetz Chaim is describing over here is, let's look at the words very carefully of the Chavetz Chaim. Shezira, what does it mean? Hainu sheyichbalem achar hatfia lishnayim. You take raw wool and you spin the raw wool into a thread. Now let's imagine that this string that I'm holding is not kafel shmoina. Let's imagine that this is one woolen thread that I spun out of raw wool. Now the Chavetz Chaim says yichbalem, double it over lishnayim. Right? Now I have 2. Then what does he say? You double it over into 2, v'yishzerem, and then you twist it. Well, now I'll twist it. Okay, now you have one string that is really a double string. It's one string that was folded, and now it was twisted together. Now, the way the Chavetz Chaim explains this, he's saying that you're starting with one thread, and you're folding that thread, and then you're twisting it itself together. I believe that it doesn't have to be that way. You could actually take 2 independent strings and just twist those together. It doesn't have to be that you take one string and double it and twist it that way. You could take 2 strings, like so. I'll take 2 strings. Here I have 2 strings. And now, just twist it together. Easier said than done like this. But you just twist it together until it forms one double string. So, from what the Chavetz Chaim said so far, the strict requirement of shazira, of having a twisted strand, which we're going to see very shortly in the Mishnah Berurah, is very possibly a requirement that's midaraisa. It's a biblical requirement. You could fulfill that requirement by just making a double strand. If you take 2 strings together and you twist them together, you already mekayim shazira. I'm just going to read Ois Katan Yodalid from the beginning here. Shazira, hainu sheyichbalei makarat tfiyah lishnayim. This means that you double it over after you spin it into a thread into 2, v'yishzerem, and then you spin it together, so now you have a double strand. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, V'im kafal kol chut lishmoina, and if you would double up each string until you have 8 strands, ushizarai, and then twist 8 strands together, gam kain leslon ba. That would also be okay. Now, literally, the words mean gam kain leslon ba. That's not a problem. If you twist it into 8, it's not a problem. Well, how are you going to twist it into 8? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to double it and twist it, right? So now I have 2. Then you'll double it again, and then twist it again. Well, now I have 4. And then if you double it again and twist it again, you're going to have 8. That's one way of making 8. Another way of making 8 is the way that our tzitzis are typically made, which is like I showed you before. You take one strand, you take 4 threads, you twist it together into one string. Then you take another 4 threads, you spin those together into one string. Then you take those 2 strings and you twist them together, and now you have kafel shmoina. Now, I'll point out that the Chavetz Chaim writes this in a very interesting way. He says that if you do this, if you make it into 8, gam kain leslon ba. We don't have a problem with it. It's okay. Very interesting way of writing it. Let's see what develops. Now, continues the Chavetz Chaim here. V'tam laha shazira. What's the tam? What's the reason that we do this shazira? Why do we do this? Why do we twist it together? The Mechaber doesn't say. He says tzrichin shazira, but he doesn't say why. Says the Chavetz Chaim, the Tana b'Sifri, because we have a brisa in the Sifri that says va'asu lahem tzitzis. The Torah Dirshu says Moshe Rabbeinu should tell Klal Yisrael va'asu lahem tzitzis. They should make for themselves tzitzis. Shemei ani. We would hear from that pasuk, Yaset tzitzis, k'moi shehu. You should make very simple, basic tzitzis. Take strings and hang them from a beged. Doesn't say here any kind of requirement of twisting. Talmud loymar, to teach us not that way, the pasuk says, V'nosenu al tzitzis hakanaf pisil techelis. You should place on the tzitzits of the corner pisil techelis. You should take a psil, and the psil should be made out of tchelis. Tchelis is blue wool, or a bluish color, from the dam of the chilazon. Now, we know, I read to you the pasuk for Parshas Tetzaveh before, where we're speaking about the Meleches HaMishkan. And by the Meleches HaMishkan, we also need tchelis, right? Zav, tchelis, argaman, telah, shani, v'sheish, moshazar. It has to be twisted. Says the Chavetz Chaim, the brisa tells us that from the fact that the Torah Dirshu tells us to add tchelis to the tzitzits, we learn out betavoi v'shazur. It means that all the threads have to be spun and then twisted. Pirish, ke'ein mishkan, similar to the mishkan, tehevi shazur. So, where do we get that from? Again, where are we getting the comparison from tzitzits to the mishkan? From the requirement of tchelis. The same way we have tchelis by the Big Day Kahuna, so too we have tchelis by the tzitzits, and that brings us to a second comparison. The same way by the Meleches HaMishkan we need mashzar, so too by the tzitzits we need shizar. Inami, or there's another pirish that you could have, how we learn out the requirement of shizira from the pasuk of V'nosenu al tzitzis hakanaf psil techeles, and that is from the word psil, not from the word techeles, but from the word psil. Distam psila hi shizura, because a common psil, and I'm not sure if psil over here means a wick, like a candle, or I'm not sure. But the Chavetz Chaim tells us here that a psil, the word psil, connotes a twisted strand. Okay. Ainli elatchelis. Okay, so wait a second. If this is how we know that you need shazira, how do we know if you learn it out from psil? Maybe you don't have such a strong kasha. But even if you learn it out from psil, you're learning it out from psil techelis. And according to the first pshat, you're learning out the need of shazira just from the word techelis. So ainli elatchelis. Maybe it's only the techelis strand of the tzitzits that needs shazira. And if that was true, then nowadays when we don't have techelis, we wouldn't need shazira at all. So ein lielet chelis, lavan menayin. How do we know that the white strings of the tzitzits also require shazira? Amra Torah, the Torah Dirshu says, tein tchelis, tein lavan. The requirement of tzitzis is white strings and blue strings. Matcheles tavu v'shazor. Once the Torah Kedosha tells us that the tcheles strings need tevia and shazira, aflavan tavu v'shazor. We don't have a reason to differentiate between the blue strings and the white strings. So that's how we know that you need shazira, va'ayin be'biur halacha, and then he sends us to the biur halacha. Now, biur halacha dibra maschil utzrichin shazira has a lengthy discussion over here about the requirement of shazira and what you have to do in order to fulfill the requirement. Now, a little bit more than halfway down in that Dibra Maschil of the Biur Halacha are the words of Al Kol Panim. So I'm not going to read the whole Biur Halacha, it's a long Biur Halacha, but let's go to the nitty gritty of the Biur Halacha, which is the words of Al Kol Panim. Says the Chavetz Chaim. We have different shittas over here of what you have to do to meet the requirement of Shazira. V'al Kol Panim, but at least L'chol ha-paiskim, according to all of the paiskim, dai sheyihiyeh shazor l'shnayim. The basic requirement of shazira is to have two threads twisted together, so that you have a double thread. Once you have a double thread, according to all the paiskim, you it's enough that to have a double thread, and you are mekayim shazira. Vayin Bartzes Achayim. Having said that, he says, take a look at the Malbim in the Artzes Achayim. Shehevi, who brings down the Yeshayimrim, that there are those that say the mitzvah min amuvchar, that to do the mitzvah in the chosen way, in the best way, toiv sheyiyeh kol chut kafel l'shmeina. It would be good that each string should actually be kafel shmeina, and that's what I tried to show you here on these tzitzis over here. And again, you can't really see it because the camera can't pick it up, but I have a double, this one tzitzit string is two strings twisted together, but each one of those two strings is four strings twisted together. So in this one tzitzit strand, I actually have 8 strings, and that's what the Malbim brings is the mitzvah min amuvchar. Now the Chavetz Chaim says something that is very precious. He says something very precious, and it's an important lesson for us to learn that's again not only to tzitzis, but a lot of mitzvahs. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'ulam, the truth is, V'ulam, be'emes, taimeya ani, I look in wonder, al ha-mahadrin, on those that chase after the mahadrin, liknois dafka kafel shmeina. The Chavetz Chaim says, I look in wonderment at those that are mahader to go get tzitzis that are kafel shmeina. Shehu al kol panim rak lemitzvah min amuvchar lekulei alma, which is only a mitzvah min amuvchar lekulei alma, and people are mamish mahader to go get kafel shmeina, but it's zicha only like a hidur mitzvah. It's a mitzvah min amuvchar. So what's wrong with that? Says the Chavetz Chaim, it would be more worthy of them lechatchila lahader al hatzitzits, to be mahader after the tzitzits, leda, to know imheim tevuyim ushazurim lishma kedin al yidei Yisrael, before you go run to go get tzitzits that are mamish kafel shmeina. Before you do that, which is only a mitzvah min amuvchar, first, go make sure that you're being mekayim the ikar din. Go make sure that the tzitzis that you're getting were spun and twisted lishma. Ki yesh mekaymais, because he says there are places shesoimchin litvais tzitzis al yedei goy betzivu Yisrael. He says there are many places where they have enom Yehudim who are going and spinning and twisting the tzitzit strings, and they're doing it, they're relying on the kula that we learned yesterday, where an Eino Yehudi does it, and the Yisrael goes and is mitzvah them, he tells them that you should do it lishma, which we saw as a machlokes Rishonim, the Rambam and the Rosh, and the Rambam holds it's mamish puzzle. So says the Chavetz Chaim, you're running to go be mahader to get tzitzit strings that are kafel shmeina. But how about meikra din, to make sure that they were really done lishma? That's far more important, says the Chavetz Chaim. Or they're following other kulos of this nature. Vayin b'simin zeh b'Mishnah Berurah sif cotton test v'yud. Remember what we said yesterday in the Mishnah Berurah ois cotton test and in ois cotton yud, that even according to the Rush, who holds that it's kosher, if you have a Yisrael Oimed al Gabav of the Eino Yehudi, and he's mitzvah him to do it lishma, it only works if it's a short time period. You're being relying on a lot of kulas over here. So he says you're going and you're chasing a mitzvah ben amuvkar, but you're ignoring these kulas. Then he closes off the Biur Halacha by saying this tapakti. The Chavetz Chaim says, I have a suffix. This is very interesting. What happens if you have a double string that was twisted for tzitzis? It wasn't done for tzitzis. You have a double string, shizurim l'shnayim shaloi l'shma. The twisting into a double string was done shaloi l'shma. V'achakach shizurim l'shmayna l'shma. So you have, let's say, an Eino Yehudi took two threads. He twisted them together into a double thread, but he did not do it l'shma. So right now it's possible for tzitzis. Now you take it and you fold it over another 2 times and you twist it again and you make it kafel shmeina, and that you did lishma. Does your twisting it into kafel shmeina lishma undo the damage of the Eino Yehudi twisting it into a double strand? The Chavetz Chaim says he's mesupik. Okay, now we go right. So now we see the requirement of shizira. Now we go to Ois Cotton Tezvav. The Mechaber said that the shizira has to be done lishman. That also has to be done l'shei mitzvah tzitzis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the mitvia ve'elech, because anything that is done after the spinning of the raw wool into a thread, hu hakoil b'chlal asiya, that is all included in the asiya of the tzitzis, which we learned gedilim taseh loch, and we said the word loch is extra, and from loch we learn out loch b'shvil choivach. The tzitzis the asiyah of the tzitzis has to be done in l'shem mitzvah tzitzis, so that you could be mekayim your chiyuv. And anything that comes after the original spinning of the thread is included in this asiyah that must be done lishma. The Kasav of Magen Avraham, and the Magen Avraham writes, says the Chavetz Chaim, that even b'di'evet, if the twisting of the tzitzis strings was not done lishman, they are puzzle. V'chein mashma mi Biur Hagra, and it is implied that way from the Biur Hagra as well. And now let's take a 2-second dive into Biur Halacha Dibra Mascha Lishman, where the Mishnah Berurah says, Ayin b'Mishnah Berurah, v'hu midivrei Hagra, imkein mashma dehu dvar Torah. According to this Magen Avraham and the Biur Hagra, where they say that the lack of shizira lishma passes the tzitzis even b'di'eved. Why is that? Because they hold that the requirement of shizira is mamish midaraisa. So that when we said in the previous ice cotton of the Mishnah Berurah that we learn it out from nasnu al tzitzis hakanaf psil techelis, that's not just an asmachta. That's a bona fide drasha, and it's a requirement midaraisa, the shizira. Okay, let's go back into the Mishnah Berurah ice cotton tezvav. However, while that is the sheet of the Magen Avraham and the Gra, v'yesh bekilin, there are those who rule leniently, b'di'eved af bilti shizira. There are those who say that b'di'eved, tzitzis are kosher even if they are not twisted at all. So b'di'eved, you took raw wool, you spun it into a thread, and now you just have a single thread, and you're going to make the tzitzis out of single threads that are not twisted. B'di'eved, that would be okay. However, the conclusion of the Chavetz Chaim and the Biur Halacha is that you should not rely on this kula. But if the shazira was done stam, it wasn't done with beferish intent lishma, yesh lahakal b'di'eved, then b'di'eved you could be makel, kevan da'tviya haya lishma, since the spinning of the thread was done lishma, the chala oisa al dasa rishayna hu oisa. So if somebody spun the tzitzis lishma, and then he went and he twisted it, but he didn't say he's doing it lishma, we could rely on the fact that since he started the malacha of the tzitzis lishma, it was continued lishma as well. Moving on to Sif Gimel. Says the Mechaber, Im nisparku mishizirasan, let's say the shizira of the tzitzis came apart. Nisparku, it came apart, like I started doing to this poor abused tzitzis string, where I started on twisting it. So let's say the twisting comes apart. Truth is, I'm not 100% sure what they do to keep it together so well. I think they wet it and then they dry it this way. Maybe they heat it. I'm not sure. But if it really comes apart, not the way it is over here, but it really comes apart, over the length of the string, the twisting comes apart. V'nasu shisha osar, so that you have 16 strings. How 16 strings? Well, I told you, this one tzitzis string is really comprised of 16 individual strings. It's 2 strings, and each one of those, back up. No. The one corner of tzitzis has 8 strings. Now, to meet the minimum requirement of shizira, each one of those 8 strings has to be double. So let's say they all come apart. So 8 times 2 is 16. So instead of 8 strings on the corner of the tzitzis, you now have 16. That's the case of the Mechaber. Im nisparku mishizirasan, if the twisting comes apart, then nasu shisha asar, so now the 8 strings that you have on one corner of your tzitzis breaks down to 16 strings. Kisherim, it's still kosher, says the Mechaber. But for who sheyishtayer bashizor kedei aniva, in order for it to be kosher, it has to be that not the entire string came apart. It came apart from the tip almost all the way down to the bottom. But at the end, at the bottom over here, you have a part of the string that is still twisted. And how long is it? Kedei aniva. Long enough that you could take it and you could form a slip knot. That's kedei aniva. So again, what does the Mechaber say? You need shizira. You need each one of the 8 tzitzis strings on a corner have to be at least 2 strings twisted together. That's a requirement. You need shizira. We saw that according to the Gra and the Magen Avraham, it might even be a requirement midaraisa. Says the Mechaber, if the shizira came apart, even if it came apart on all 8 strings, so now you have 16 strings, it's still kosher. But when is it still kosher? It's still kosher if it didn't come apart in its entirety. Each one of the strings, each one of the 8 strings, has a small portion that is still twisted. What size portion? Kedei aniva. A large enough portion that you could use to form a slip knot. So says the Mechaber. Says the Ramah Haggah, u'lechatchila, toiv, it would be good, likshar hachutin lamata, to make a knot in the string lamata. What does lamata mean? Lamata means, here's the gedil of the tzitzits. Lamata means down here, at the end of the string. He says it's toiv to take the string and make a knot in the end of the string. If you make a knot at the end of the string, it can't come apart. That will hold the twisting together. That's what the Ramah says. And he brings this down from the Beis Yosef, who brings it down in the name of the Rokeach. Okay, now let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Ois Katan Tezayin. The Mechaber said, if the twisting comes apart, so now your 8 tzitzis strings turned into 16. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'nasu shisha asar pirush shenisparek kol hashmoina chutin. How did you get 16? Because on one corner you have 8 strings. If all 8 strings came apart, each one is double. So if they all came apart, now you have 16. And the Chavetz Chaim says, V'lerevusa dereisha nokte. Why does the Mechaber say, why does the Mechaber give us a case where all 8 strings came apart, so now you have 16? Because he's teaching us a chiddush. He's telling us, even if all 8 came apart, not 1 came apart, not 2 came apart, all 8 came apart, so that you have 16, it's still kosher if you have kedei aniva left on each string. So that's a chiddush he's telling me. Aval hu adin im nispark shnei chutin v'nasu arba. Gam kein be'inon sheyishtar kedei aniva. However, the Chavetz Chaim points out, let's say all 8 strings didn't come apart. Let's say only 2 strings came apart, right? And those 2 strings broke down into 4 strings. Gam kein be'inon sheyishtar kedei aniva. You still are going to require kedei aniva on those 2 strings. In other words, the Chavetz Chaim is saying like this: there's really room, chas v'chalila, to make a mistake in the halacha over here. The Mechaber gave us a case where all 8 strings came apart. If all 8 strings came apart, so that now you have 16 strings, it's kosher if on all 8 strings you still have kedei aniva. Says the Chavetz Chaim, the only reason the Mechaber gave us such a case is to tell us a chiddush. Even if all 8 strings came apart, so that now you have 16, it's still kosher if you have kedei aniva. Now you might make a mistake. You might say, okay, the Mechaber only discusses the halacha if all 8 strings came apart. So mistama, if only 2 strings came apart, I don't have to worry about it at all. If only 2 strings came apart, I'm fine. I only have to worry about this halacha if all 8 strings came apart. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. If 2 strings came apart, you already need that on those 2 strings, you need kedei aniva. Why? I'll explain to you why. If you have less than kedei aniva on a string, it's as if that string is not there. Now, we have 8 strings on a corner. How do we have 8 strings? The reason we have 8 strings, we don't start off on each corner with 8 strings. We start off with 4 strings. We take 4 strings, we put them through the hole on the beged, we double it over, and that's how we get 8. Now, because of that, when you look at the corner of the tzitzis, and you have like this, coming out of the knot, you have 4 on one side and 4 on the other side, if you have 2 strings, right, if let's say one whole string rips off, if one whole string rips off, you didn't lose an entire string, because the other half of this string is somewhere else. It's somewhere in these other 7. Somewhere in these other 7 is the other half of this one. So even if one string rips off totally, you're still okay. Because from the 4 original strings, you still have 3.5. So you're okay. But what if 2 strings rip off? If 2 strings rip off, it's possible that those 2 strings that ripped off are really 2 halves of the same string. And if both halves of the same string ripped off, then you lost an entire string. Now you only have 3 strings, you don't have 4 strings. Now your tzitzis are possible. Therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah over here, if 2 strings came apart, so that their twisting came apart, you must have that they're still twisted kedei aniva. Because if you have 2 strings where the shazira came apart all the way to the end, then it's as if those 2 strings are not there anymore. And if those 2 strings are not there anymore, it's possible that what that really means is that one entire string is missing. Because what you're calling 2 strings is in fact 2 halves of the same string. So once you have 2 strings where the shazira comes apart, you must have kedei aniva left where there still is twisting. Hope you can follow all that. Okay. So again, I'm just going to read from the beginning of Eis Katan Tezayin. Pirush, when the Mechaber talks about 8 that became 16, Pirush, Shenispare kol hashmona chutin. The case on the Mechaber is where all 8 strings on one corner came apart, so that you have 16. But, says the Chavetz Chaim, v'lerevusa dereisha nokte. The Mechaber is only giving me this case to tell me a chiddush in the first case of Siv Gimel, where he says it's kosher if you have left kedei aniva. Aval hu adinim nispark shnei chutin. But the same halacha applies if 2 strings would come apart, the shazira would come apart, v'nasu arba, so that those 2 strings now are 4, gam kein be'inon sheyishtayer kedei aniva. You still would need that you have leftover kedei aniva from those 2 strings. Dilavachi puzzle, because if not, the tzitzis are puzzle. They have because now it's as if 2 strings of your tzitzis ripped off. The puzzle, which is puzzle, because they might be 2 halves of the same string, and you lost an entire string. And in that case, your tzitzis are puzzle. The puzzle im loy dictate b'shas asiyah sheyia la'olam arba rashi mitzad echad ukid la'kaman b'reish siman yud beis. And I'll explain what that means. I just told you that the problem is if 2 strings rip off, they might not be 2 strings. They might be 2 halves of the same string, and you might have lost an entire string. That's why when you lose 2 strings, your tzitzis are puzzle. So too, if 2 strings, the shazira comes apart, it might not be 2 strings where the shazira came apart. It might be 2 halves of the same string where the shazira came apart, which would be puzzle. So if 2 strings come apart, you need kedei aniva. What does the Chavetz Chaim say here at the closing? There is a way to make your tzitzis, to make sure that in certain cases, if you lose 2 strings, your tzitzis are still kosher. How is that? So remember what I told you. Tzitzis on each corner begins with 4 strings. We put 4 strings through the hole, we double it over, and then we start tying the knots and making the coils. Now, if you're careful when you make your tzitzis, you make sure that when the 8 strings come out of the knots, and you have 4 on one side and 4 on the other side, you make sure that you keep track of the strings so that you know these 4 strings are all halves of one string, and these 4 strings are all the other halves of these 4 strings. And not that on one side you might have both halves of one string. If you do that, then if one string tears off from one side of the knot, and another string tears off on the same side of the knot, you know that you don't have both halves of one string, because both halves of one string cannot possibly be on the same side of the knot. So that would be kosher. If you lose 1 string on one side of the knot and 1 string on the other side of the knot, then it's puzzle, because that might be 2 halves of the same string. Okay. Oiskan Yudzain, Kedei Aniva. You have to have remaining a portion of the string, the long enough to be able to form a slip knot that is still twisted together. Even though later, in Siman Yud Beis, we're going to see there is a shita that holds that if all the tzitzis are ripped off and all you have left from all 8 strings are kedei aniva, it's actually puzzle. So over here, if the twisting came apart on all 8 strings and you only have kedei aniva of each string that still has shazira, why is that kosher? According to that opinion later, having 8 strings where the shazira came apart and all you have left from all 8 is kedei aniva, it's as if they were ripped off. And all you have left is kedei aniva, so it should be puzzle. Mikamagam, nevertheless, b'shazira, when it comes to twisting, samchinin adei rishayna dehilchasa kavasa. We rely on the first opinion in Siman Yud Beis, who holds that it's kosher, k'moshe pasak sham. And you can see that in the Magen Avraham and the Pri Megadim. V'da oid, and you should know furthermore, da Shulchan Aruch Mairi, the Shulchan Aruch is discussing a case, dafka b'shazar kolchot l'shnayim. The whole discussion over here in the Mechaber, where the Mechaber gives us a case where you had 8 strings that became untwisted, so you have 16. Clearly, he's discussing a case where each one of the tzitzit strings is only a double string. It's not kafel shmeina, it's double. Avalim kafel v'shazar la'arba oy l'shmeina shamotzli bizmanenu. But if you have tzitzit strings that are kafel shmeina, like most of our tzitzit strings are, v'nisparku l'shisha asar, and they became untwisted to the extent that you have 16. So again, our tzitzis are kafel shmeina. How are they kafel shmeina? Like I told you earlier, it's each one of the tzitzit strings is double. It's 2 strands twisted together, but each individual strand is 4. So 2 4s twisted together make 8. So now, if the twisting of the 2 4s come apart, and now I have 16, yes, I have 16, but each one of them still has shazira, because each one of them is still twisted into 4. So therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, Avalam kafel v'shazar la'arba or l'shmeina kama shamasi b'zbaneinu and isparkul l'shisha asar. Afilu l'mlein nishtayr kedei aniva kosher. Even if you don't have left kedei aniva, it's still kosher. Ta'al kalpanim nishar achutin shazar l'shnayim. Because still we're talking about strings that are still twisted. Or l'inyan bal taisif ayin b'bir halacha. Very interesting shaila the Bir Halacha discusses. Wait a second. You're telling me that you had 8 strings and they untwisted and it became 16. Maybe there's a shaila of Bal Taisif. So the Bir Halacha discusses it. It's Bir Halacha Dibra Maskal V'Naseh Shisha Asar. And he says over there, Ach, Kedei Shelo Yavra Bal Taisif. In order to make sure that you're not over on Bal Taisif, Yoimar Beferish, you should make a clear verbal statement that you don't want the Teisefes, or cut off the extra strings. Okay. The Ramah said that it would be a good idea to tie a knot at the end of the string so that we don't have this problem, the string cannot untwist. Says the Chavetz Chaim, there are those that say there are those that say that you should not make knots. Why? Because the tzitzis are supposed to have a certain amount of knots. By adding a knot on the end of each string, you're adding knots. We don't want to add knots. And it is good to be machmir. If they are well twisted, so that it's not shriach, that they should come apart, so be machmir and do not tie any additional knots. And he brings this down. Okay, we'll stop over here. Continue tomorrow with Sif Dalet. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah should be begging against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem should send Yeshua's refuahs parnasah shedurchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicha to see the Bias Goyal Tzedek b'mehera v'yameinu. Amen. Be well. Thank you.